Sarah Mitchell's coffee was still warm when she vanished on Valentine's Day 1987 in Bozeman, Montana. But here's what nobody knew for 34 years. The man trusted to protect their children every morning was the same man who had murdered their beloved waitress. And every single day, he stood at Roosevelt Elementary with his orange safety vest and stop sign, hiding the most sinister secret this mountain town had ever known. The 19-year-old waitress had just finished her closing shift at Rosie's Diner when she stepped into what would become Montana's most haunting mystery. Her burgundy wool coat disappeared into the swirling snow at 10:47 p.m., and by 11:47 p.m., her Honda Civic was found running empty on County Road 86. Door hanging open like a scream frozen in time. But the real shock wasn't her disappearance. It was discovering that her killer had spent the next 3 decades earning the community's trust while concealing the darkest crime in Gallatin County history. At exactly 10:45 p.m. on February 14, 1987, the last customer had left Rosie's Diner on North 7th Avenue. Sarah Mitchell, known throughout Bozeman for her punctuality and genuine warmth, was methodically stacking chairs on tables when the first snowflakes of what meteorologists would later call the storm of the century began their relentless descent against the frost-covered window. Helen Kowalski, the diner's manager, would later tell investigators that Sarah seemed different that evening, not distracted exactly, but preoccupied in a way that wasn't typical for the girl who usually hummed while she worked. Sarah checked the wall clock more frequently than usual, glancing toward the windows where snow had begun accumulating in patterns that suggested this wouldn't be just another Montana winter storm. By 10:43 p.m., the fluorescent lights were dimmed, the clothes sign was flipped, and Sarah was pulling her burgundy wool coat tight around her shoulders. Helen watched through the diner's front window as Sarah walked toward the employee parking area, her footsteps leaving the first tracks in what was rapidly becoming a significant snowfall. Her 1983 Honda Civic sat alone under the single parking lot light, the car that had been a graduation gift from her parents and had never failed to start even in Montana's most brutal winters. What happened in those crucial 60 feet between Rosie's back door and that Honda would consume the next 34 years of questions, theories, and heartbreak. But the answer was hiding in plain sight, living just 8 blocks away, watching the investigation unfold from behind concerned eyes that fooled everyone who looked into them. Jeremy Walsh was driving home from his late shift at Bozeman Lumber Mill at 11:47 p.m., taking County Road 86 to avoid the worst of the storm. His headlights suddenly illuminated something that made him slam on his brakes. Sarah's Honda, sitting in the middle of the road like an abandoned stage prop. The engine was running, exhaust visible in the frigid air, headlights creating cones of light that illuminated falling snow like glitter in a snow globe. The driver's side door hung wide open, and Jeremy could hear KBOZ's late-night country classics playing, the station Sarah always preferred. Her brown leather purse remained on the passenger seat, wallet intact, along with $43.67 in tips she'd counted twice that evening. Her keys dangled from the ignition, the engine running smoothly despite the accumulating snow. But Sarah was gone, vanished. The only evidence of struggle was a single scuff mark in the snow beside the open door, and her left brown leather flat, discovered 15 feet away, partially buried beneath the snowfall. Jeremy's 911 call came at 11:52 p.m. "There's a car just sitting here with the door open and nobody in. Something real bad happened out here." What Jeremy didn't know was that someone else had been at that scene less than 30 minutes earlier. Someone who understood exactly how to manipulate evidence, someone who had planned this moment for weeks, someone who would spend the next 34 years walking past the very people who mourned Sarah while carrying the secret of what he'd done. Sheriff Tom Bradley received the call at 12:07 a.m., jolting him from deep sleep after a quiet Valentine's Day. At 52, Bradley had been elected based more on his softball coaching reputation than investigative experience. He had campaigned on community policing, never imagining he'd face a case that would test every resource his department possessed. Deputy Mark Stevens, 26 and fresh from community college criminal justice, arrived at the snow was falling harder now, visibility limited to 50 feet. In the darkness and storm, Stevens made decisions that would haunt the investigation forever. He allowed Jeremy to drive Sarah's Honda back to town, contaminating the crime scene. The scuff mark disappeared under continued snowfall before it could be photographed. But what Stevens didn't know was that someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures had already been there, manipulating the scene to create maximum confusion, while monitoring police radio communications from his own vehicle as he drove slowly home through the storm. Sarah's parents, Richard and Patricia Mitchell, received the call at 1:15 a.m. Patricia, a mathematics teacher known for logical thinking and meticulous organization, immediately began constructing timelines while fighting off panic. Richard, who managed parts at Morrison Motors, approached the crisis with methodical logic, asking about search procedures and available resources. Neither could comprehend how their responsible daughter could simply vanish from a car showing no signs of trouble. The initial search began at first light, with Sheriff Bradley coordinating every available resource. By 8:00 a.m., nearly 60 people were participating, working in grid patterns through snow-covered terrain. Among those early volunteers was William Hendricks, a 35-year-old maintenance worker at Gallatin County Medical Center, who lived alone on Elm Street, 8 blocks from the diner. Hendricks had heard about the search on his police scanner, a device he kept tuned to emergency frequencies as a hobby. He immediately drove to the sheriff's department to offer assistance, telling Deputy Stevens he knew the rural roads better than almost anyone, because of his work responding to emergency calls. Bradley was grateful for his offer and assigned Hendricks to lead a group of 12 volunteers, searching northwest of where Sarah's car was found. What Bradley didn't know was that William Hendricks already knew exactly where Sarah Mitchell was located. He had put her there himself, less than 6 hours earlier, after the most carefully planned crime in Gallatin County history. And now, with chilling calm, Hendricks was leading search parties through areas he knew would yield nothing, while maintaining the concerned facade of a community member trying to help. The search continued for 3 days, expanding to cover 40 square miles. Searchers called Sarah's name continuously, their voices carrying across the February landscape. The community response was overwhelming, with people driving from neighboring counties to help look for the popular waitress who had served their coffee and always remembered their names. Margaret Henderson, an elderly woman living near one of the search areas, would later tell investigators she'd noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck parked near her property on February 4. The truck had been there several hours, which was unusual for the rural road that saw little traffic, especially during snowstorms, but Margaret hadn't written down the license plate or paid close attention to detail. What Margaret had observed was William Hendricks disposing of evidence from Sarah Mitchell's murder. The pickup belonged to the medical center, and Hendricks had legitimate access for emergency call. He had used it to transport Sarah's body to an abandoned mine shaft 27 miles northeast of Bozeman, a location he had scouted weeks earlier that provided perfect isolation and concealment. By February 18, Sheriff Bradley faced pressure from multiple directions. The Bozeman Daily Chronicle ran daily front-page stories, questioning the department's competence. Parents refused to let daughters work evening shifts. The tourism industry worried about negative publicity. Bradley needed a suspect, and he thought he found one in Danny Kowalski, Helen's 22-year-old son who had dated Sarah briefly the previous summer. Danny became the focus of an investigation driven by desperation rather than evidence. His past relationship with Sarah provided motive. His knowledge of her schedule created opportunity. Under relentless questioning, Danny's story contained minor inconsistencies that investigators interpreted as deception. The arrest came March 3rd, but charges collapsed in July when security footage from Murphy's bar corroborated his alibi. While Danny was wrongly accused, the real killer continued his normal life. William Hendricks had successfully deflected suspicion by being the helpful citizen who volunteered for search parties. He knew every technique police were using because he'd been there for all of it. More chilling still, Hendricks used his medical center position to stay informed about the investigation's progress through law enforcement connections. The failure to solve Sarah's case quickly was actually working in Hendricks' favor. As weeks became months and the investigation stalled, public attention shifted to other concerns. New crimes required immediate attention. Sarah Mitchell's case gradually moved from active investigation to cold case status, filed away with other unsolved mysteries that small departments hoped might someday yield to new evidence. What nobody realized was that Hendricks had spent months studying criminal investigation techniques through books, television shows, and conversations with law enforcement personnel he encountered through work. He understood forensic procedures well enough to manipulate them. Most importantly, he understood the psychological profiles investigators would develop, and he had carefully positioned himself to be invisible to their scrutiny. The decision to apply for a crossing guard position at Roosevelt Elementary came to Hendricks in late 1990, 3.5 years after Sarah's murder. His medical center work had become stressful, but more significantly, Hendricks realized his current position kept him in contact with law enforcement personnel who might eventually connect him to Sarah's disappearance. By positioning himself as a protector of children, Hendricks could accomplish several goals simultaneously. He would remove himself from the medical center environment where his shift schedules might raise questions. He would establish himself as a pillar of community safety, making him psychologically invisible to anyone looking for a predator. Most cunningly, he would gain the trust of the very people most concerned about safety following Sarah Mitchell's unsolved murder. On September 4, 1991, William Hendricks began his career as crossing guard at Roosevelt Elementary. He stood at North 7th Avenue and Pine Street, wearing the orange safety vest and carrying the stop sign that would become symbols of protection and trust for hundreds of children over 3 decades. Parents waved gratefully from car windows. Teachers praised his dedication. The school district would give him multiple employee appreciation awards. But every morning, as Hendricks smiled and waved at those trusting children, he carried the secret of what he had done to Sarah Mitchell on that snowy Valentine's Day. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain this facade for 30 years revealed a level of sociopathy that would later shock forensic psychiatrists who studied his case. Patricia Mitchell's basement became a shrine to obsession that would define the next 34 years of her life. The mathematics teacher transformed the space beneath her home into an investigative command center, examining evidence with the magnifying glass Richard had bought for their 20th anniversary, now repurposed for a use neither had ever imagined. The wall map of Gallatin County bore hundreds of colored pins, red for confirmed sightings, blue for unverified reports, yellow for false leads that had broken her heart one by one. Patricia could recite the coordinates of each pin from memory along with dates, times, and witnesses. She maintained detailed files on every person questioned during the investigation, creating psychological profiles that often surpassed official work. The most heartbreaking aspect was that the answer walked past her house every morning at exactly 6. William Hendricks had moved to Elm Street in 1992, just 1 year after becoming a crossing guard and 5 years after murdering Sarah. The bitter irony was devastating. Patricia spent decades searching for her daughter's killer while he lived 3 blocks away, occasionally stopping to chat when they encountered each other at the store. Hendricks had chosen his address carefully, understanding that living near the Mitchell family would provide intelligence about the ongoing investigation while making him appear above suspicion. Who would be brazen enough to live so close to his victim's family? The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and effective, allowing Hendricks to monitor Patricia's activities while maintaining his concerned community member facade. The toll on the Mitchell marriage was catastrophic. Richard initially supported Patricia's investigation efforts, but as months became years and her activities became obsessive, he felt like he was living with a stranger who cared more about solving their daughter's case than healing their family's wounds. The divorce papers were filed in December 1995, 8 years after Sarah's disappearance. Throughout this period, William Hendricks continued his daily routine as Roosevelt Elementary's trusted crossing guard, observing the Mitchell family's destruction with detached interest. He attended Patricia's annual vigils at the site where Sarah's car was found, standing among mourners and offering quiet support while knowing exactly what had happened to the daughter they were commemorating. The vigils had begun as family gatherings, but evolved into community events drawing participants from throughout Gallatin County. Each February 14th, Patricia arrived at County Road 86 with flowers and battery-powered lanterns, reading from the journal she'd kept since Sarah's disappearance. Hendricks's attendance at these vigils represented perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of his 30-year deception, standing among Sarah's loved ones while carrying the secret of his crime. The emergence of the internet brought new hope to Patricia's investigation but also attracted false leads and amateur investigators whose theories caused more confusion than clarity. Patricia learned to navigate online databases, joined message boards for unsolved crimes, and corresponded with other victim families, creating a network of shared information and mutual support. But Patricia's reputation within law enforcement gradually shifted from grieving mother to persistent nuisance, whose theories consumed resources better used elsewhere. Her increasingly erratic behavior and public criticism of the investigation were actually helping Hendricks maintain his anonymity, as attention focused on supposed departmental incompetence rather than identifying the real killer. By 2000, 13 years after Sarah's disappearance, William Hendricks had achieved something remarkable in criminal psychology. He had successfully integrated his identity as a killer with his public persona as community protector. The compartmentalization that allowed him to function normally while carrying such a devastating secret represented sociopathy existing in perhaps 1% of the population. Hendricks had not killed again after Sarah Mitchell, which would later puzzle criminal psychologists. Most serial killers escalate over time, but Hendricks seemed satisfied with the perfect crime he'd committed and the ongoing deception he maintained. The risk of another murder was too great, and the psychological satisfaction he derived from watching the community struggle with Sarah's unsolved disappearance fulfilled whatever needs had driven him to kill initially. His daily routine provided structure while keeping him connected to the community he'd betrayed so fundamentally. Children trusted him completely, running up to show artwork or share stories about lost teeth and birthday parties. Parents relied on his vigilance to keep their precious children safe. Teachers praised his dedication, often using him as an example of positive community involvement in school safety. The first significant challenge to Hendrix's security came in 2003, when the Montana State Crime Lab implemented new DNA analysis techniques that could extract genetic profiles from smaller and more degraded samples than had been possible in. Sheriff Janet Carlson, who had replaced Bradley, authorized re-examination of evidence from several cold cases, including items from Sarah Mitchell's Honda. Hendrix learned about this development through his friendship with Deputy Tom Morrison, who mentioned the DNA testing during casual conversation at a community barbecue, not realizing he was providing crucial intelligence to the very person the tests were designed to identify. The coffee cup collected from Sarah's Honda became the focus of intense scientific analysis. New testing revealed the cup contained DNA from two individuals, Sarah Mitchell and an unknown male subject. The unknown profile was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, TODIS, which compared genetic markers against millions of profiles from convicted criminals and unsolved cases nationwide. The initial search produced no matches, indicating Sarah's killer had either never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA submission, or had committed the crime before mandatory collection became standard. Sheriff Carlson informed Patricia Mitchell about the DNA breakthrough, hoping concrete scientific evidence might provide some measure of hope after 16 years of disappointment. Patricia's reaction was complex, vindicated in her belief that Sarah had been murdered, but terrified by new questions about whether the killer was still in the area, whether he'd killed others, and most disturbing of all, whether he was someone she knew. Hendrix's reaction to learning about DNA breakthrough was calculated rather than emotional. His first concern was whether the genetic profile would be sufficient to identify him if he were ever required to provide a sample. He began researching DNA analysis through internet resources and library materials, educating himself about genetic profiling and law enforcement comparison procedures. The knowledge that his genetic signature was stored in a database, waiting for a match that would instantly identify him as Sarah's killer, created constant psychological pressure Hendrix had never experienced. Every police car, every conversation with law enforcement, every news report about DNA solving cold cases reminded him that his perfect crime was no longer quite as perfect. But Hendrix understood that DNA evidence alone wasn't sufficient for prosecution. Investigators would need additional evidence, witness testimony, and most importantly, they would need to identify him as a suspect worthy of DNA comparison. This led him to maintain his normal routine rather than fleeing, reasoning that sudden departure would raise suspicions among people who'd known him for decades. Detective Lisa Chen arrived in Bozeman during summer 2019 with a background in cold case investigations and a master's degree in forensic science. The 38-year-old former Seattle investigator had specifically requested Montana assignment because she wanted to work complex cases where individual efforts could significantly impact unsolved mysteries that had frustrated investigators for years. Chen's first meeting with Sarah Mitchell's case files occurred in the basement evidence room where cardboard boxes from the 1980s sat alongside modern digital storage systems. The contrast between old and new investigative techniques was immediately apparent, with yellowed crime scene photographs stored next to DNA evidence analyzed using technology that didn't exist when Sarah disappeared. Chen's breakthrough came while examining photographs of Sarah's abandoned Honda. She noticed that 1987 crime scene technicians had collected a coffee cup from the vehicle's holder, apparently assuming it belonged to Sarah. The cup had been stored in a paper evidence bag and forgotten for 32 years, its potential significance overlooked by investigators lacking DNA analysis technology. The enhanced DNA analysis Chen authorized represented forensic science's cutting edge, utilizing extraction techniques that could isolate genetic material from increasingly smaller and degraded samples. Results arrived in Chen's email on January 23, 2020, with information that would fundamentally transform the investigation. The cup contained DNA from Sarah Mitchell and an unknown male subject. The unknown profile was entered into CODIS, but produced no direct matches, suggesting Sarah's killer had never been arrested for a felony or had committed the crime before mandatory collection. However, the profile was suitable for forensic genetic genealogy, a revolutionary approach using commercial ancestry databases to identify suspects through genetic relationships to distant relatives. Chen worked with forensic genetic genealogist C.C. Moore to analyze the unknown male's DNA using publicly available databases containing millions of genetic profiles from ancestry enthusiasts who had unknowingly contributed to criminal investigation. The process involved comparing crime scene DNA against these databases to identify potential genetic relatives, then constructing family trees to narrow possible suspects. The genetic genealogy analysis consumed 4 months of computer processing and family tree construction. Moore's team identified several distant genetic matches, indicating the unknown subject was likely descended from German and Irish immigrants who settled in Montana during the late. The analysis suggested the killer was probably male, 30 to 50 years old at the time of Sarah's murder, and had likely lived in the Bozeman area most of his life. The breakthrough came when Moore's analysis identified a genetic connection to the Hendricks family line. The relationship was distant, approximately third or fourth cousins, but provided the first concrete lead since the DNA profile was developed. Moore began constructing detailed family trees for various Hendricks branches, using birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and obituaries to track descendants fitting the killer's profile. William Thomas Hendricks emerged as a person of interest through genealogical analysis, though his connection seemed peripheral initially. Born in 1952 in Bozeman, he would have been 35 at the time of Sarah's murder, within the suggested age range. His employment history showed jobs providing vehicle access and rural road knowledge, first medical center maintenance, then elementary school crossing guard. Chen's initial background investigation revealed what appeared to be an exemplary life. Hendricks had lived in Bozeman his entire adult life, maintaining steady employment and building a reputation as a reliable, helpful community member. His only criminal history consisted of minor traffic violations, and employment records contained consistently positive evaluations, describing him as dependable, quiet, and well-respected. But Chen's experience had taught her to look beyond surface appearances, particularly in cases involving long-term deception. She began conducting discreet surveillance while researching Hendricks's activities during February. The investigation required careful balance between gathering information and avoiding detection, as premature disclosure might prompt flight or evidence destruction. Surveillance photographs captured Hendricks in ordinary moments, defining his public persona for 33. Here he stood outside Roosevelt Elementary at 7 a.m. Orange safety vest reflecting sunlight as children crossed under his protection. There he sat on his porch reading the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, while coffee steamed in crisp mountain air. To casual observers, Hendricks embodied small-town responsibility and civic engagement. He maintained a lawn neighborhood children used as a school shortcut, grew tomatoes he shared with elderly neighbors, and displayed a faded Montana State University sticker that had never been replaced. His daily routine was predictable and unremarkable. But Chen noticed subtle details suggesting enormous psychological pressure. Hendricks' hands shook when unlocking his door each evening, fumbling with keys he'd handled thousands of times. His garbage bins, previously organized with military precision, now overflowed with empty whiskey bottles and takeout containers from restaurants he'd never patronized during earlier surveillance. Most telling were Hendricks's visits to Sunset Hills Cemetery, where Sarah Mitchell had eventually been buried after her remains were recovered. What had once been weekly visits to various graves became daily ritual focused specifically on Sarah's headstone. Chen watched through telephoto lenses as Hendricks knelt beside the granite marker, lips moving in conversations no one else could hear, shoulders shaking with sobs emerging from decades of buried guilt. The decision to confront Hendricks directly required careful timing and strategic planning. Chen understood that direct accusation without sufficient evidence might prompt flight or evidence destruction, but allowing him to continue normal routine risked psychological deterioration that might render him incapable of coherent testimony about Sarah's fate. Chen chose to apply gradually increasing pressure, beginning with seemingly routine follow-up questions and building toward revelation of genetic evidence. She contacted Hendricks by phone March 10, 2021, identifying herself as a detective conducting comprehensive cold case reviews, including Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Hendricks agreed to meet at the sheriff's department, displaying cooperative demeanor he'd maintained during night. But Chen immediately noticed stress signs absent from earlier surveillance: shallow, rapid breathing, hands clasped tightly to control trembling, eyes darting toward the interview room door as if calculating escape route. The first interview lasted 90 minutes, with Chen carefully reviewing basic facts while observing Hendricks's reactions. His recollection of February 14, 1987, was remarkably detailed for events occurring 34 years earlier, suggesting the date held special significance. He volunteered information about search participation, concern for the Mitchell family, and shock that such terrible crime could happen in their peaceful community. But Chen noticed subtle inconsistencies that became more pronounced as the interview continued. His work schedule description changed slightly between questions, with overtime shifts and emergency calls becoming vague when pressed for specific. Most significantly, he volunteered explanations for circumstances Chen hadn't yet questioned. Behavior of a guilty conscience attempting to stay ahead of inevitable revelation. The second interview occurred March 13th, when Chen revealed that new forensic techniques had been applied to Sarah's evidence. Hendrix's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, hands began trembling uncontrollably, and he requested a recess to use the restroom. Chen could hear him vomiting through thin walls, and when he returned, his carefully constructed facade was cracking visibly. The psychological pressure intensified during Chen's third interview March 15th, when she informed Hendrix that DNA evidence had produced a genetic profile being compared against databases containing millions of samples. His breathing became labored, skin took on grayish pallor, and his entire body began shaking as if experiencing medical emergency. But instead of requesting legal representation, Hendrix whispered words Chen had been hoping to hear. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Sarah was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did to her." The confession that followed was fragmented and emotional, punctuated by sobs and long silences as Hendrix struggled to articulate actions he'd kept secret for more than half his life. He revealed that he'd been obsessing about Sarah for weeks before her murder, watching her from a distance and learning her schedule through careful observation. On Valentine's Day 1987, Hendrix had positioned himself along County Road 86, knowing Sarah would likely use that route to avoid the storm. When her Honda appeared in his headlights around 11:30 p.m., he'd used his medical center vehicle to force her off the road, then approached under the pretense of offering assistance with apparent mechanical problems. Sarah had initially been grateful for help from someone she recognized as a hospital employee, trusting the uniform and official vehicle that identified Hendrix as legitimate authority. But when she realized his true intentions, she fought desperately, scratching his face and arms before he overpowered her through brute force and surprise. The actual murder had taken place in Hendrix's vehicle, where he strangled Sarah with his bare hands in a frenzy lasting several minutes. The psychological aftermath was immediate and devastating, with Hendrix realizing he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But instead of turning himself in, he made the calculated decision to cover up his crime and continue his normal life. The disposal of Sarah's body required hours of careful planning and execution. Hendrix had driven to the abandoned mine shaft he'd identified weeks earlier, a location providing perfect concealment, while being close enough to Bozeman that he could return home before his absence was noted. He spent additional time staging the scene at County Road 86, positioning Sarah's car and personal effects to create the impression she'd been abducted by someone else. The most chilling aspect of Hendrix's confession was his description of psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to function normally while carrying such devastating secrets. He explained that he'd trained himself to separate the crime from daily life, treating his crossing guard work as penance for what he'd done to Sarah. The arrest of William Hendrix on March 15, 2021, exactly 34 years and 1 month after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, sent shockwaves through Bozeman that would take years to process. The man who had guided their children safely across busy intersections every morning for 3 decades was revealed as the killer who had terrorized their community and destroyed the Mitchell family. Sheriff Patricia Hayes held a press conference that evening before a room packed with reporters, parents and community members struggling to comprehend how they'd been deceived so long. The revelation that Hendrix had not only committed murder but participated in original search efforts, attended memorial services, and lived blocks from Patricia Mitchell while she spent decades seeking answers represented psychological manipulation none had imagined possible. Patricia Mitchell, now 74, received the news at her home, where she'd maintained her basement investigation center for 34 years. Detective Chen's 6,000 a.m. call carried the weight of delivering news Patricia had both longed for and dreaded. When Patricia finally spoke after long silence, her first words weren't about justice or closure, but a simple question: where is my daughter? The recovery of Sarah Mitchell's remains from the abandoned mine shaft took place over 3 days in April 2021, with specialized equipment and forensic experts working to extract evidence hidden for more than 3 decades. Patricia Mitchell stood at the perimeter, watching as her daughter finally came home, her vigil of 34 years finally ending. William Hendrix pleaded guilty to first-degree murder June 18, 2021, accepting life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His confession provided details Patricia had sought for most of her adult life, but also revealed the devastating reality that Sarah's killer had been hiding in plain sight, trusted by the very community he'd betrayed so fundamentally. The psychological impact on Roosevelt Elementary and the hundreds of children Hendrix had guided to safety over 3 decades would require years of counseling and community healing. Parents struggled with realizing they had thanked Sarah Mitchell's killer every morning, trusting him with their most precious possessions, while he carried the secret of his crime. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Margaret Thompson noted that Hendrick's 30-year deception represented not just Sarah Mitchell's murder, but theft of security and trust from an entire community. His crime demonstrated how effectively evil could hide behind civic responsibility, using public service as camouflage for the darkest possible betrayal. Patricia Mitchell's victim impact statement was brief but devastating. "For 34 years I searched for my daughter's killer, never knowing he was watching me suffer while pretending to care about our community's safety. No sentence can restore the decades we lost, but at least Sarah can finally rest in peace." The case files that had consumed Patricia's basement were finally closed, but questions about how such deception was possible would haunt Bozeman for generations. Sarah Mitchell's story became a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear orange safety vests and spend 30 years earning trust they never deserved. William Hendricks died in prison in 2023, taking with him any remaining secrets about other potential victims. His death marked the final chapter in a case that had defined a community's understanding of evil, trust, and the terrible price of misplaced faith in those we believe will protect us. But the investigation into Hendricks' life revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond Sarah Mitchell's murder. Detective Chen discovered that during his 30 years as a crossing guard, Hendricks had maintained detailed mental notes about children's routines, family situations, and home security measures. His house, when finally searched after his confession, contained notebooks filled with observations about school schedules, parent pickup times, and which children walked home alone. The most chilling discovery came from Hendricks' basement, where investigators found a collection of photographs he had taken over 3 decades. Images of children crossing the street, playing in nearby parks, and walking to and from school. The photographs were organized in manila folders labeled by year, creating a timeline of his access to potential victims that spanned from. None of the images were inappropriate in themselves, but the systematic nature of the collection revealed a predatory mind that had been documenting opportunities for 30 years. Among Hendricks' possessions, investigators also found newspaper clippings about other missing persons cases throughout Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The articles dated back to the early 1990s and included cases involving young women who had disappeared under circumstances similar to Sarah Mitchell's: isolated locations, evening hours, vehicles found abandoned with personal belongings intact. While no definitive links were established, the collection suggested that Hendricks had maintained an ongoing interest in similar crimes across the region. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Hendricks during his confession, published a comprehensive study of his case that became required reading in criminal psychology programs nationwide. Foster's analysis revealed that Hendricks represented a rare category of offender, the community-integrated predator, who successfully embeds himself in positions of trust while maintaining predatory behaviors over extended periods. According to Foster's research, Hendricks' choice to become a crossing guard was not coincidental, but represented a calculated strategy to establish himself as above suspicion while gaining access to detailed information about potential victims and their family. His position allowed him to observe children's behavioral patterns, identify vulnerable individuals, and monitor community safety measures that might interfere with future criminal activity. The psychological profile that emerged from Foster's study painted a picture of extraordinary self-control combined with patient, methodical planning. Hendricks had apparently satisfied his predatory urges through the murder of Sarah Mitchell, then channeled his remaining impulses into elaborate fantasy scenarios involving the children he observed daily. The crossing guard position provided him with a socially acceptable outlet for his need to control and monitor potential victims while maintaining the facade of community service. Foster's most disturbing finding was that Hendricks had likely experienced sexual arousal from the power dynamics involved in his daily interactions with trusting children and grateful parents. The position of crossing guard had allowed him to be simultaneously predator and protector, deriving satisfaction from both his hidden knowledge of his true nature and the community's complete dependence on his supposed dedication to child safety. The investigation into Hendricks' activities during his medical center employment years revealed additional concerning patterns. Former colleagues remembered that he had volunteered for overtime shifts that involved emergency calls to remote locations, particularly during evening and weekend hours when supervision was minimal. His access to medical center vehicles had provided him with transportation that wouldn't raise questions if spotted in unusual locations during non-business hours. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Hendricks had maintained detailed knowledge of police communication procedures, shift schedules, and investigative protocols through his extensive network of law enforcement friendships. This intelligence had allowed him to monitor the Sarah Mitchell investigation's progress while positioning himself as a valuable community resource rather than a potential suspect. The revelation of Hendricks' true nature, prompted a comprehensive review of safety protocols at elementary schools throughout Montana. The state legislature passed Sarah Mitchell Child Protection Act in 2022, requiring enhanced background checks, psychological evaluations, and ongoing monitoring for all school employees and volunteers who had regular contact with children. The legislation also mandated annual training for educators on recognizing signs of predatory behavior among staff and community volunteers. Roosevelt Elementary School underwent a complete transformation following Hendricks' arrest, with new security measures, updated policies for volunteer screening, and comprehensive counseling programs for students, staff and families affected by the revelation of their trusted crossing guard's true nature. The intersection where Hendricks had stood for 30 years was renamed Sarah Mitchell Memorial Corner, with a permanent plaque honoring her memory and acknowledging the community's commitment to never again allow such deception to flourish on children. Patricia Mitchell, despite her advanced age and declining health, became a vocal advocate for cold case investigation funding and victim family support services. She testified before the Montana legislature about the importance of maintaining hope and continuing investigation efforts even when cases seemed hopeless. Her basement command center was eventually donated to the Montana Cold Case Foundation, where her meticulous documentation methods became a model for other families seeking answers about missing loved ones. The Sarah Mitchell case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach community integration and trust verification. Detective Chen's methodical approach to re-examining old evidence using new technology became a template for cold case investigations nationwide. While her careful surveillance and interrogation techniques were incorporated into training programs for investigators specializing in long-term deception cases, the community of Bozeman struggled for years to process the psychological trauma of discovering that their most trusted community member had been living a lie for 3 decades. Support groups were established for parents whose children had daily contact with Hendricks, and mental health professionals noted increased rates of anxiety and trust issues among families who had relied on his protection. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Sarah Mitchell's case was the recognition that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears an orange safety vest, arrives early for work every day, and spends 30 years earning trust while hiding the darkest possible secret. The case served as a permanent reminder that vigilance and verification must always accompany trust, especially when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The final irony of William Hendricks' 34-year deception was that his eventual capture resulted not from brilliant detective work or community suspicion, but from the simple fact that he had left behind a coffee cup in Sarah Mitchell's car on that snowy Valentine's. The trace amounts of saliva that would eventually betray him had been waiting patiently in an evidence room for technology to catch up with justice, proving that sometimes the smallest details can topple even the most carefully constructed lie. The coffee cup itself became a symbol of both tragedy and hope in the law enforcement community. Detective Chen kept a photograph of the evidence bag on her desk as a reminder that no case is ever truly cold, only waiting for the right combination of technology, persistence, and timing. The cup was eventually displayed in the Montana Law Enforcement Museum alongside Sarah's story, serving as an educational tool for future investigators about the importance of preserving even seemingly insignificant evidence. In the months following Hendricks' death, additional evidence emerged that painted an even more disturbing picture of his psychological state during his final years. His medical records revealed that he had been prescribed anti-anxiety medications beginning in 2019, the same year Detective Chen had begun her investigation. His physician noted that Hendricks complained of insomnia, panic attacks, and recurring nightmares, symptoms that aligned perfectly with the timeline of the genetic genealogy analysis that would eventually identify him. Prison guards reported that Hendricks had maintained a detailed journal during his incarceration, writing obsessively about his memories of February 4th. The journal, which filled more than 300 pages before his death, provided investigators with the most complete account of Sarah Mitchell's final hours ever documented. The entries revealed not only the methodical planning that preceded her murder, but also the profound psychological toll that maintaining his deception had exacted over 3 decades. According to the journal, Hendricks had experienced what he described as episodes throughout his career as a crossing guard, moments when the sight of a particular child or parent would trigger vivid flashbacks to Sarah's murder. He wrote about the constant fear of discovery, the exhausting effort required to maintain his helpful facade, and the growing paranoia that someone would eventually connect him to the crime he had committed. Most disturbing were Hendricks' detailed descriptions of how he had used his position to gather intelligence about ongoing investigation efforts. He had cultivated friendships with law enforcement personnel specifically to monitor progress on Sarah's case, attending retirement parties and community events where officers would discuss cold case developments. His journal revealed that he had learned about the DNA testing breakthrough months before Detective Chen had contacted him, allowing him time to prepare psychologically for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The journal entries also documented Hendrix's growing obsession with other missing persons cases throughout the region. He had apparently studied dozens of unsolved disappearances, looking for patterns that might indicate whether investigators were developing theories that could potentially implicate him in additional crimes. While no evidence was ever found linking him to other murders, his intimate knowledge of these cases suggested a level of involvement that went far beyond casual interest. Emily Richardson, a criminologist at Montana State University who specialized in long-term deception cases, spent 2 years analyzing Hendrix's journal entries and behavioral patterns. Her research, published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, identified several warning signs that might have indicated his true nature if anyone had been looking for them. These included his reluctance to form close personal relationships, his excessive interest in police procedures and investigative techniques, and his habit of volunteering for community activities that provided him with information about local families and security measures. Richardson's study became instrumental in developing new screening protocols for positions involving access to children in vulnerable populations. Her research demonstrated that individuals capable of maintaining such elaborate deceptions over extended periods often displayed subtle behavioral markers that could be identified through properly designed psychological evaluations and background investigation. The impact of Sarah Mitchell's case extended far beyond Montana's borders, influencing cold case investigation techniques throughout the United States. Detective Chen was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country, sharing her methodical approach to evidence re-examination and the importance of genetic genealogy in solving decades-old crime. Her techniques were incorporated into training programs at the FBI Academy in Quantico, where new agents learned to approach cold cases with the same systematic thoroughness that had finally brought justice for Sarah. The case also prompted significant changes in evidence storage and preservation protocols at law enforcement agencies nationwide. The fact that a coffee cup stored in suboptimal conditions for 32 years had ultimately provided the key evidence needed for prosecution highlighted the critical importance of maintaining proper environmental controls and chain of custody procedures for all potential evidence. Regardless of how insignificant it might initially appear, Patricia Mitchell lived to see these changes implemented, though her health declined rapidly following the resolution of her daughter's case. Friends and family members noted that while she was grateful for the answers she had finally received, the psychological toll of 34 years spent searching for those answers had fundamentally altered her personality and worldview. She passed away in 2022 at the age of 76, her obituary noting that she had been reunited with her beloved daughter Sarah after a lifetime of seeking justice. The house on Cattleman's Road where the Mitchell family had lived became a pilgrimage site of sorts for other families of missing persons. Patricia's methodical documentation techniques and refusal to give up hope inspired countless other parents and siblings to continue their own searches for answers. The basement command center was preserved exactly as Patricia had left it, serving as both memorial and practical resource for the Montana Cold Case Foundation. Richard Mitchell, who had divorced Patricia in 1995, remarried and moved to Arizona, where he lived quietly until his death. He never spoke publicly about Sarah's case after the divorce, but friends reported that he followed the investigation's progress closely and was deeply relieved when Hendrix was finally arrested. His second wife noted that he had never fully recovered from the trauma of losing his daughter and watching his first marriage collapse under the weight of obsessive grief. The Roosevelt Elementary School community established the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship in 2022, providing annual funding for students pursuing careers in law enforcement, forensic science, or victim advocacy. The scholarship ceremony takes place each February 14th at the school, with recipients required to research and present on topics related to child safety and community vigilance. The scholarship serves as both memorial to Sarah and educational tool for future generations who might help prevent similar tragedy. Detective Chen continued working cold cases in Montana until her retirement in 2024. Solving 6 additional decades-old murders using techniques she had refined during the Sarah Mitchell investigation. She frequently spoke about the importance of never giving up on cases that seemed impossible to solve, emphasizing that advances in technology and investigative methods could breathe new life into even the most challenging investigation. Her final case before retirement was the 1993 disappearance of a college student in Missoula, solved using genetic genealogy techniques that had been inspired by Sarah's case. The intersection where Sarah Mitchell's car had been found was eventually renamed Sarah Mitchell Memorial Highway, with a permanent marker describing her story and the 34-year investigation that finally brought her killer to justice. The memorial serves as a reminder to travelers about the importance of community vigilance and the devastating impact that violent crime can have on small communities that believe themselves to be safe from such tragedy. Hendrix's house on Elm Street was demolished in 2023 after remaining vacant for 2 years following his arrest. No buyers could be found despite the property's desirable location and modest asking price. The psychological taint of its association with Sarah's murder proved impossible to overcome. The lot was eventually purchased by the city of Bozeman and converted into a small park dedicated to victims of unsolved crimes, with benches and memorial plaques honoring the memory of those whose cases remain open. The legacy of Sarah Mitchell's case continues to influence criminal justice policy and investigative techniques more than 3 years after its resolution. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that the combination of scientific advancement, investigative persistence, and community support can eventually overcome even the most sophisticated deception. Most importantly, her case demonstrated that the monsters living among us don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear uniforms, carry signs, and spend decades earning trust they never deserved, making vigilance and verification essential components of community safety.